It is a fundamentally, in my view, wrong-headed policy. Do people, excuse me, have the right to have wrong-headed policies? Sure. All my Democrat friends have the right to have wrong-headed policies, too. That's what a democratic nation is about. We can disagree about policy, and we can all think that the other is wrong-headed. But that is where the argument over neoconservatism ought to be fought, over the fundamentals of policy, because ultimately the intellectuals are only as strong as the number of people who read their books, as Grover says, and the same with the journalists. If you don't open a newspaper, you have no idea what any of these journalists have said.
Bob, thank you very much. Actually, now I feel a little more optimistic. Would you like to answer now, or would you mind waiting till the end?
I can wait, or whatever.
I think it would be better.
Maybe I'll just make two quick remarks. First on Grover. Grover essentially, I had lunch with William F. Buckley Jr. at the New York Yacht Club when I was starting this book out, and I thought, well, you know, I'll be meeting Buckley and he'll have all these insights. And so we got there at 11 in the morning, and he immediately orders 2 stiff drinks for us. And then we proceed to lunch. And I ask a few questions about the neocons. He says, well, to be honest, I don't really think they're all that important. And after about 10 minutes, we just started chatting. He was obviously uninterested in the neocon subject as a mainstream conservative. And the way I interpreted that, and Grover and I can thrash this out later, I think there is a reluctance. In Buckley's case, he wanted to keep the glory for himself. I mean, it wasn't that explicit, but that's the way I interpreted it. He said, you know, the neocons added a little polish, but they didn't provide anything of substance. And I think that's sort of where Grover is heading. On the Israel question, just to address stuff, I was trying to argue that Bush was actually not hijacked by a Jewish cabal, but that there were other impulses, and we can debate about the influence of the Holocaust. I think on that issue, it's an interesting one. You could accuse. I talk about this in the opening chapter about my own background, and I suppose you could accuse me of transposing my own history onto the larger movement. However, my own personal experience through the years has been that it is an element, perhaps among younger neoconservatives as well. Anyway, with that, let's take some questions.
Daniel Shore, and please introduce yourself in a way that not only people in the room, but also C-SPAN audience would be able to understand. Dan Shore.
My name is Dan Shore, and I work for National Public Radio. Is that enough of an introduction? Oh, is there a mic? Okay. My question goes like this, and it really is addressed to anyone who can speak for or about the neocons. I recall, I'm old enough to remember when the communist movement in the United States was rent apart by the Hitler-Stalin Pact. A lot of people who had thought one way began to see they were wrong when Hitler and Stalin signed the pact, and that their position was untenable. I wonder whether that is ever going to happen. Will there come a time when neocons will look back at the war on Iraq, which they helped to unleash, and say, boy, were we wrong?
Well, that's the only one person that I've heard really say that, I think, forthrightly, is Ken Edelman, who I have a lot of respect for in that regard. I would compare the Iraq War for the American intellectual class more, I think it's more similar to the Spanish Civil War, where the left had illusions about the nature of that war and utopian impulses. And to me, the neocons today are on the right, and they seem, while they didn't actually go to fight in Iraq the way the Abraham Lincoln Brigade fought in Spain, it seems to me that intellectually the same kind of mental collapse would have to happen at some point, that they would recognize that the Iraq War was not only a mistake, but it has triggered precisely the opposite tendencies that they predicted. Instead of more democratization in the Middle East, we see the rise of authoritarian movements. We see an Afghanistan that's on the brink. Pakistan is in far worse shape than it was before we attacked Iraq. Iraq may, and to some degree, stabilize, but to claim that as a victory seems to me nonsensical. It was a sideshow. It turns out to be a complete sideshow, with the real stakes being in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, whether the neoconservatives will ever come to accept that, a few have. I was telling Dimitri about a younger neoconservative named Larry Kaplan who sobered up and takes a very different view of the Iraq War now, because he actually went there and spent a lot of time there. But for most of the neocons, I've always thought this was like the Spanish Civil War, an abstract concept. They're not really interested in Iraq per se. Iraq was a ground, an area in which you would create a democracy. But it wasn't, they weren't interested in the details and how you actually pull any of this off. And so they've invested in it psychically. And it looks to me like they're unwilling to recognize that it's gone sour.
I actually know the answer to that.
Let me do this. I will let Grover respond, but I just want to mention that we have 18 minutes left and already 4 people on my list, and I presume that there may be more. So I want to encourage everyone to be very brief in questions and in responses.
The neocons can have perspective on this in 100 years. And the reason for that is Max Boot had been writing about how exciting it was when the United States took over the Philippines to turn it into Kansas City. And I was reading his book and some of his articles. I sent him an email. I said, what was the advantage to the United States of having fought the war with Spain, specifically over the Philippines? Thinking perhaps there was some argument that this had been helpful to us in World War II or whatever. And he said, well, none actually, but it showed we could do it. So 100 years afterwards, he was willing to sort of say there wasn't a point to it.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. One thing you shouldn't overlook is that Don Rumsfeld really did intend to pull out quickly. There was a logic behind it. The logic was that if Jay Garner would have stayed, we would have simply decapitated the leadership of the ministries. The Ba'ath would have been left in place. The military would have been left in place, and we would have had very few troops there by the end of that year. I know because I had funded that number of troops. The neocons have turned on Rumsfeld in particular. They said that he screwed up the implementation, but Rumsfeld never talked about democracy, and Jacob mentions that in his book. So I totally agree. I don't know if it'll be 100 years or 500 years or whatever, but I don't see neocons recanting on any of this.
Steve,
Jacob, I want to compliment you on the book. I've read it carefully, but I want to
could you
ask
introduce yourself?
I'm Steve Clemens. I run the foreign policy programs at the New America Foundation in Washington and have enjoyed participating in Grover's Wednesday meetings, if I'm allowed to say that. The question I have has to do with the legacy and the history of the journal, which the Nixon Center now, of which you're a senior editor, and which used to be in the House of Crystal. And it's very interesting to look at why the neoconservatives seem to matter in this era, and to look structurally at why they were significant and why they let that journal go. But nonetheless, they kept the rival journal, Public Interest, which largely focused on domestic political issues, that focused on health, education, budget, fiscal issues, but never really got very far. And I was remembering in this very room when Francis Fukuyama, who was then either setting up his own rival church in the neoconservative camp or defecting, essentially said, if we didn't feel in the neoconservative camp that we could sculpt social outcomes in Anacostia, what made us think we could sculpt outcomes in Baghdad? And so my question to you is, the neoconservatives today are thought of as those people very engaged in foreign policy and national security issues, but they let national interest go to this institution. And thus, I'm wondering, is this another point at which they stumbled but nonetheless succeeded just enough to sort of reframe and recast what they're good at? And if you would reflect a little bit about that, since you were in the old venue with national interest as well as in the new venue of national interest.
Well, just quickly, guess that gets back to my neocon credentials are probably being exaggerated somewhat in the book reviews. But the national interest under Owen Harries and Irving Kristol was not a magazine crusading for democracy. I mean, Irving Kristol, I don't think he believes a word of it. And Owen didn't believe a word of the Fukuyama article when it appeared. He ran it because he was a good editor and he knew it would create a controversy. So I think for the neoconservative movement, I don't know all the details because I wasn't that involved with the magazine, but for Irving and Owen, it was, I assume they just weren't that interested in perpetuating the magazine. I mean, Irving Kristol also, they let the public interest die. So I think the more interesting question is to focus in on Robert Kagan's influence on William Kristol, because William Kristol was not that interested in foreign policy in the early 90s, and I think pretty much shared his father's realist views. But Kagan came along, as I try to explain in the book, and said, hey, we got to get some wind in Bob Dole's sails. We have to go with a positive program, and here it is, which is an aggressive foreign policy.
I'm Harlan Ullman, the Washington Times, and a couple of think tanks. Jacob, I have not read your book, so I speak with some degree of ignorance. But my question really refers to the importance of the presidency. If you really want to do an interesting book, you might want to take a look at George Bush, at Andover, Yale, Harvard, Walker's Point, and the Air National Guard, because I think you will find a very interesting personality. You talked about CCNY. Perhaps their most distinguished graduate was Colin Powell. And Colin failed to do what he wanted to do, by his own admission, with George W. Bush. If you go back and take a look at the war plan, Polo Step, which you can get off the GW Security archives, you will see that the Department of Defense then was planning to have fewer than 2,000 Americans left in Iraq as of 6 months ago. I mean, it's very interesting. So my question is, because in my view, the neocons, this is an interesting issue, but they're irrelevant. This is George Bush. And the point is, we're going to elect a new president, and we seem to over-exaggerate the role of outside advisors. I think at the end of the day, the person sitting behind the desk at 1600 makes the call, and they're going to do what a man or a woman has got to do, and we underplay that. And I just wanted to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it probably does get lost, and I don't know if I emphasize it sufficiently in the book or not, that of course George W. Bush makes the call. However, from the beginning, I remember talking to Paul Wolfowitz in 1999, and he, maybe he was flattering himself, but boy, I mean, he was, he says, Bush is another Scoop Jackson, he gets it, he understands. So, I mean, I don't think you can completely discount the role of advisors, and particularly, let's face it, Condi Rice and Colin Powell got shut out. There's an interesting episode in this new book by Elizabeth Buhlmuller about Condi Rice, where she goes to Bush and says, Vice President Dick Cheney is trying to hold national security meetings when you're gone and doesn't want me to do it. See, in the first weeks already, Cheney was trying to cut out Rice. So that didn't fly. But then they went and made all the decisions in the Oval Office. It didn't matter what. Colin Powell's calling Condi Rice and saying, why can't you keep things running? And she's saying, I don't know what's going on.
Go back to the August 5th, 2002 dinner with Powell and the president, and you get an entirely different view.
Yeah, I agree with Harlan on this. I mean, first of all, let's not forget that there was one other motivating factor. You want to talk psychology? How would you feel if somebody tried to kill your dad? Saddam Hussein tried to kill former President Bush. Did that not weigh at all on the current president's mind? I doubt it. I don't know how big a factor it was, but boy, that seems to me like a factor. Was Condi Rice totally end run by my former boss and Dick Cheney? Not entirely, no. Were there efforts to end run? Yes, everybody in government's always trying to end run everybody else. That's neither here nor there. What really mattered was that this president made up his mind. Harlan is absolutely right. And if the president had wavered, then you would have seen a very different kind of debate.
Bob Murray.
I'm Bob Mary. I run Congressional Quarterly, and I've written a bit about the neocons. Jacob, I'd like to pursue